that. And also, yes, as was mentioned, if you all could please mute your microphones during the event so that we can hear the presenters, we would appreciate it. So thank you all for joining us. This is just our second installment of our book launch series, and we are very excited. I am just going to briefly introduce our wonderful co-moderators, Tammy and Susan, and then I will introduce Michelle, who's going to speak for a few minutes before we open it up for discussion. So Tammy Proctor is a distinguished professor in the Department of History at Utah State University, and she is one of the new co-editors of the Journal of British Studies. Her books include Female Intelligence, Women and Espionage in the First World War in 2003, Civilians in a World at War in 2010, An English Governess in the Great War, The Secret Diary of Mary Thorpe in 2017, and with Sophie de Shaepdrijver, Gender and the Great War in 2017, and then also with our co-moderator Susan Grayzel. She was also author of World War I: A Short History in 2017. So her next book, Saving Europe, is due out from Oxford University Press next year. So hopefully we will also be meeting again to discuss her book. And Susan Grayzel, who will also be co-moderating, is professor of history at Utah State University, where she researches and teaches about modern European history, women's and gender history, the history of the world wars, and war and culture. Her publications in these areas include Women's Identities at War in 1999 and At Home and Under Fire in 2012, and with Tammy Proctor, Gender in the Great War in 2017. Her latest book is The Age of the Gas Mask: How British Civilians Face the Terrors of Total War, which was published in 2022. And so we are here to discuss Michelle Tusan's book. Michelle is professor of history at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. She received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 1999. And prior to joining the faculty at UNLV, she was a fellow in the humanities at Stanford. Her teaching and scholarship broadly engaged the relationship between geopolitics, culture, and human rights. And she is the author of works like The British Empire and the Armenian Genocide, Humanitarianism and Imperial Politics from Gladstone to Churchill in 2017 and 2019. Smyrna's Ashes, Humanitarianism, Genocide, and the Birth of the Middle East in 2012. Women Making News, Gender and Journalism in Modern Britain from 2005. And of course, she is the current vice president and president-elect of NACBS. And we are here to discuss her latest work. So with that, I will turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you all for coming. It's nice to see you, however, virtually. I hope we see most of you in Baltimore in November. Thank you, Amanda, for organizing this. Amanda has spearheaded this initiative, and it's a wonderful opportunity for people to present work, and I thank you, Amanda. Thank you also to Tammy and Sue for agreeing to participate today. All right, I'll get started. I'm just going to give you a little overview of the book. I'm going to show you one of my war maps, and then we'll move on to the two comments. The First World War was a war of empires that started in the Balkans and ended in the Middle East. The last treaty focuses on the Middle Eastern Front, a term I deploy to describe the war in Ottoman territory in the Eastern Mediterranean that included the struggle for what was then Mesopotamia, as well as North Africa and Anatolia. It paralleled the war fought in Europe and the Balkans between the Central Powers, led by the German and Austro-Hungarian empires, and the Allies, led by the British, French, Russian, and American empires. What I'm calling the Long War between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire had devastating consequences for civilians caught in its wake. I end my history of the First World War with the 1923 Lausanne Treaty because the Versailles Treaty failed to end it in 1919. War and peacemaking between the Allies and the Ottoman Empire between 1914 and 1923 were integral to the First World War. War fought on the Middle Eastern Front required navigating the space between the nation state and new global alignments where humanitarianism, international justice, and refugee policy found new and uneasy articulation. Britain played an outsized role on this front and guided the peace process to advantage its empire and protect its supremacy within the nascent international system. The British Empire supplied the majority of Allied troops in the Middle East, and British diplomats determined the course of the peace settlement, first with the Treaty of Sèvres and later the Treaty of Lausanne. I wrote the last treaty in part to understand why some historians still see the war as mostly a European story. Can you guys see me? I got a blank screen, no? We're okay? Okay. War historiography segregates fighting in the Ottoman Empire from Europe. Mapping the different fronts together, fronts of the war together, challenges this perspective. And here I want to show you my war front maps, or map. And I'll just speak about it now briefly. Can you see the map? Yes? Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you. The Middle Eastern and Western fronts mirrored one another. Trench warfare happened on both fronts at the beginning, but by 1917 gave way to a war of movement in Mesopotamia, where quick, decisive victories led to the signing of the first armistice with the Ottoman Empire in October 1918. Both fronts also saw the blurring of the relationship between home and battlefront. Civilians participated in war on the Middle Eastern front just as they did on the Western front. Belligerents mobilized their economies to produce weapons, food, and resources to meet the demands of industrial warfare. New ways of seeing civilians in wartime emerged. On the Middle Eastern and Western fronts, news of the brutal treatment of non-combatants justified the war back in Europe. The call to defend civilians targeted by the Armenian genocide in spring 1915 echoed the Belgian atrocities agitation used by Britain to validate its entry into the war in August 1914. In both instances, the treatment of Christian minorities by their own government, in the case of the Ottoman Empire, and the treatment of Belgian civilians by the Germans, defending the rights of others gave the war a just cause back in Europe. Labeling this space as Middle Eastern Front rather than Ottoman Front better incorporates it into the lexicon of the First World War. Ottoman Front, the term often used by historians of Turkey, denotes the belligerent rather than the geography of a war that was defined as much by location as anything else. Designating fighting that took place among the Allies, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire as the Middle Eastern Front parallels the use of Western Front and Eastern Front that are also problematic. For example, the Western Front refers to fighting in Belgium and France, but as my map of the war fronts shows, one in front of you, the area shifts over the course of the war. The same goes for the Eastern Front regarding fighting along the Russian border. The Balkan Front and Alpine Front equally resist clear definition. While these borderless fronts lack precision, such regional designations spatially map the war to coincide with the political geography imagined by belligerents at the time. Western Front and Eastern Front are meaningful designations that continue to orient the work of war historians. Analyzing multiple fronts, Western, Eastern, Middle Eastern, and others, bounded by rough geographical designations, deepens our understanding of the First World War as a war of alliances. The Ottomans fought with the Germans on the same front together as allies. To call this the Ottoman Front, I think, obscures this important relationship. The Middle Eastern Front's integration into the war's geography renders visible colonial relationships embedded in the deployment of the term Middle East in the early 20th century. European historians rarely give this front a name. This amounts to an act of erasure, substituting clumsy nomenclature that designates fighting here as a separate set of actions. Denying a geography for this front, however hard to outline in terms of actual territory, renders it less visible to the larger action of the war than either Western or Eastern fronts. These also suffer from a similar lack of clear physical boundaries. All of these fronts do, I think. Maps, correspondence, film, and photography, the representational apparatus deployed by Europe's generals, strategists, soldiers, and diplomats, defined this space of engagement. For the British, the idea of the Middle and Near East were relational colonial terms that denoted Britain's distance from its empire in India. As I've shown elsewhere, a similar historical process of imagined geography was at work in the 19th century when the British first deployed the term Near East to designate Christian-occupied lands on the borders of Europe to define their empire. Mapping the First World War in this way forces a rethinking of both geography and chronology. Simply put, when the war ended depended on where you were. The last treaty focuses on how the First World War ended rather than argue for a new definitive end date to the war. War and peacemaking developed as an overlapping set of processes that made continued interethnic and political violence a characteristic of the years leading up to the signing of the Lausanne Treaty between the Ottoman Empire and the Allies in 1923. The last treaty of the First World War marked the end of military and diplomatic processes set in motion by the war that had devastating consequences for civilian populations across Europe and the Middle East. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed 100 years ago last July, paved the way for a modern internationalism that rejected empire in favor of the principles of state sovereignty. This shift politicized the treatment of minorities who found themselves on the wrong side of new national borders. Viewed from the rearview mirror of Lausanne, the Middle Eastern Front takes its rightful place as a crucial site in the war between empires. That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michelle. And so I will turn it over to Sue and Tammy.
So I'm going to go next, and I keep getting a flashing sign that my internet connection is unstable. So I apologize in advance if I cut out, but I am honored and delighted to be here to celebrate Michelle's new book. The Last Treaty is just a tour de force, and I'm grateful to the NACBS for the opportunity to talk about it here. It's a privilege to introduce it. It substantively and compassionately expands the horizons of the study of the First World War. As Michelle herself has just elucidated, historians of this conflict and of the 20th century more generally need the new vocabulary and map-making of the Middle Eastern Front presented in this book to convey the full meaning of the Great War. But we also need her rich analysis of how the war unfolded in, mutated, and devastated this region. Like I suspect some of you in this audience, we've been studying and researching and teaching about the First World War well before the centenary brought the war to greater public attention from 2014 to 2018. I welcome the many events and publications that the 100th anniversary brought forth, allowing for new opportunities to focus and debate the war, its sources, its experiences, its legacies. But I'm also chagrined to admit that I too followed conventional parameters when thinking of the war years. I didn't ask why this attention began in 2014 and not 2011, and why it concluded in 2018 and not in 2023. And I take some comfort in not being alone in this. For example, the wonderful open access educational resource, as we say, for teaching this war is the 1418 online encyclopedia. Many celebrated books on my shelves on the First World War use 1418 automatically. So I'm grateful, above all the many emotions that I feel about the last treaty, which includes awe, that I now have an essential book to put on that shelf that does not just suggest that we pay attention to the greater war in terms of chronology and geography, but that actually shows us how to do it. The Last Treaty is an essential book for understanding the First World War for many reasons. Here are just a few of them. It refocuses our attention to a region that was as instrumental a meeting place for the war's diverse participants as the Western Front, with profound consequences for both military and civilian populations. It thus adds to the growing literature on this war that recognizes the impossibility of fully separating war from home fronts. And the more that we can compare the Western Front, which I think most of us in this room know so well, with the Middle Eastern Front, the more profoundly we'll see the points that she just made for us, that civilians helped determine how the war was fought and won, and that it led to new ways of seeing civilians in wartime that we could never undo. The book poignantly illustrates how 1918 is far from the end of the war for millions of these same participants, civilians and combatants. The ongoing violence of 1918 to 23 was real, and it mattered, not just in the states where more attention-getting civil wars erupted after the armistice, like Russia, and for this crowd, Ireland. It highlights how debates over crucial issues like national sovereignty, the rights of minoritized populations, imperial ambitions, local politics, debates that shaped Europe, Britain, and the world, all took place in the shatter zone. It offers an analysis of international politics that humanely concentrates on the damages that total war can inflict on civilians, despite the best intentions of the rescuers and the diplomats. I am so grateful to Michelle to have this book for my own edification and for that of my students. By showing us the absolute centrality of the Middle Eastern front to the war's unfolding and legacies, the book invites new conversations about and a new appreciation for the making and unmaking of peace in 1923, one that has vital lessons 100 years on.
Okay, well, like Sue said, I'm really pleased to be able to comment on the last treaty, and thanks to NACBS for the opportunity, and to Michelle for writing this. Sue and I divided things up. She talked a little bit about the World War I piece, and I'm going to discuss why British studies scholars in particular will find this useful in their teaching and research. Before going any further, I want to say Michelle's expertise is really on display here, particularly in her ambitious mix of diplomacy, cultural history, humanitarianism, all framed within the larger military and political narrative of the war. And I think this mix of methodology makes the book of real interest to historians of humanitarianism and human rights, the emergence of modern Turkey and other nations of the Middle East, imperialism, and more. I mean, you could kind of add to the list. I should also admit that I'm a fan of her earlier work, most notably Smyrna's Ashes from 2012 and the article she's written on humanitarianism. I'll just mention here her 2014 AHR article entitled Crimes Against Humanity, which won this association's Love Prize. And I mention these partly because I feel like in reading this book, it's a culmination of a lot of her other work. Like, you know, you can see the mature ideas really coming out here in the narrative. So for me, the overarching contribution for British studies scholars and Europeanists is the way in which Michelle argues that rather than Europeans fashioning or refashioning the Middle East in the period between 1912 and 1923, which is often argued, the two regions had an interlocking series of relationships. This was a two-way street, a dialogue, an intense dialogue, if you will, and Britain's 20th century would have looked quite different without the Lausanne Treaty. Michelle makes a persuasive case that the Middle Eastern Front during the war, the Allied occupation, the failed Sèvres Treaty, the eventual settlement at Lausanne demonstrated the contradictions at the heart of liberal Britain, especially, while also reshaping European politics and diplomacy writ large. So it's a story of the war, but it's also a story about Britain's trajectory. The bitter wrangling between France and Britain in places like Syria, the exposure of competing demands of various agreements with minorities, and the need that Europeans felt to protect their own empires created an opportunity for Mustafa Kemal. That he capitalized on that opportunity and forced concessions was certainly a victory for nationalists in Turkey. Yet, as Michelle argues here, it was just as importantly a defeat for British claims of liberal internationalism and protection of minorities. Lausanne embodied the principles of nationalism and population exchange, and it did so despite British intervention. This became, in a way, a shameful chapter for British dealmakers, and scholars will be particularly interested in her reappraisal of David Lloyd George in this context. While she does not argue that Lausanne killed the Liberal Party, she does make it clear that it exposed the weaknesses of liberal politics, the British Empire, and the men involved in the negotiations. Others have written about the end of the war in the Middle East, but I think Michelle has innovated with this book in three ways. First, she makes it clear that the Middle East is no sideshow. And I should use her term, the Middle Eastern Front is no sideshow, nor should it be sidelined in the history of European politics and peacemaking. The fact that the last treaty was signed by the new Turkey is not an afterthought in the peace process, but instead it is the logical ending to 5 years of trying to make peace and ultimately failing. As one British official, Andrew Ryan, whom she quotes in chapter 7, opined, and this is a quote, "We took home peace without great honor. Still, it was peace. All the British hopes for 1918 and 1919 and a new world order led by their principles collapsed in 1923. Second, she she plays to her strengths in this book by bringing humanitarian matters into conversation with political military matters. A core chapter in the book is chapter 3, Civilians at War, which marshals a wealth of new scholarship on the occupation of the Middle East with her own primary source research. What's particularly fascinating, I think, is the way humanitarian and security needs in the region shaped British and Allied policy in multiple war zones. Here she taps into the work on the system of camps designed for transit, concentration, and refuge that were modeled on British imperial camps of the past, and which enshrined a coercive regime under the guise of care and relief. As she notes, the Middle East demonstrates quite clearly the tension between aid and geopolitics and the blurred lines between civilian and military regimes. Third, for somebody who does not identify as a military historian per se, Michelle writes a lucid and compelling account of the campaigns of the Middle East. Graduate students and seasoned professors alike should be rushing to buy this book for the chronological overview of both the military campaigns and the diplomatic process during and after the war. That she then ties this to British political history is impressive. It is in the Middle East that Lloyd George and Curzon make their ambitions clear. And I was kind of thinking about the scholarship on Germany's war in the Eastern Front and the ambitious development schemes that they imagined there, which were, of course, doomed by their defeat on the Western Front. In some ways, Lloyd George's problems were similar to those of German officials. He couldn't get the authority or the buy-in he wanted in Europe, so the Middle East became the place where he could exert more control, pull more levers, imagine a future. And I think Michelle kind of teases that out in the book. Finally, I really loved her chapter on humanitarian crusades, which covers both war relief on the ground and fundraising campaigns with films, brochures, photos that accompanied these activities. Michelle's discussion of the wonderfully named Alice in Hungerland, the 1921 film by Near East Relief, is particularly effective in crystallizing how humanitarian projects changed in later years. Emergency relief may have ended with Lausanne, but resettlement and development work in a new mode helped shape these processes globally in Britain and in the Empire. So I probably talked too long, but I would urge British studies scholars to read this book for its Britain in the world mentality and its rethinking of the end of the First World War and the peacemaking process. Congratulations to Michelle on the accomplishment.
Thank you so much. Michelle, did you want to respond to any of those before we open it up to questions at all? No? All right, so with that, we would welcome discussion at this point. If anyone wants to get started.
I'm happy to jump in.
Sure, go ahead, Dean.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, Michelle, congratulations. This sounds like a terrific book. I loved your previous book, Smyrna's Ashes, which I have with me. I haven't read the new one, but I'm intrigued by it. And one of the thoughts I have is that, well, obviously the war ends much later in the Middle East. It also ends much later in what we call the Eastern Front, right? In Central and Eastern Europe, with the reconstitution of territorial borders in Hungary and Poland, and the conflict in Russia and all of the rest of that. So placing it in that context, the anomaly in some sense is the Western Front and what happens there, and the fact that that ends without nearly as much conflict and instability. And I'm wondering if you would be interested in commenting on that, and if that makes sense to you, that the story you tell is actually part of a larger story of the continuation of the First World War across much of Europe and the Middle East, and really a consequence and effect of the collapse of these land empires after the First World War. But at any rate, just a thought, comment, and question, I suppose.
Thank you, Dane. Thanks for coming. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, this is a moment where decentering the Western Front could have been another way to talk about this book, because there's when you look for information about the Eastern Front, even, it's so paltry. There's just not a lot of narrative there in the same way that we get when you compare it to the Western Front. Yes, there is great scholarship on Russia and the Civil War, but this question of it as a continuation of the war, I think, is the one that we need to really grapple with. Are these separate instances? Is the Russian Civil War part of this world? Is what's going on in the Eastern Front just a separate set of actions? When I looked at the Middle Eastern Front, I said, no, these are not separate actions, because when you draw the line, like when you look at the war map I showed you, there is reconquest going on in the midst of this. And so I think that it makes sense in this world that I map to see this as a continuation of the war, and to see the war in this moment as ongoing rather than a set of skirmishes. Some people call it the Greco-Turkish War. I think there's a case to be made for that, but I do think that there is a continuity of warfare that's continuing. So I would be really interested to see how particularly historians of Russia and Eastern Europe might think about these what's happening after 1919 as a continuation of war, or rather they see them again in these sort of kind of post-war moment. And I think it's a question worth grappling with, and thank you for that.
Yeah, Nadia, go ahead.
Hey, Michelle, I know you worked really hard on the maps in this book, and you just started to answer this question in relationship to Dane's question, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about like what the activity of mapping allowed you to see as a historian that you might not have been able to see otherwise.
Yes, mapping. Gosh, these days making maps, you can't just draw them out. It takes a lot of effort. And there's two other wonderful maps that Todd Shirley did in the book too, talking about the pre and post war, which are more familiar to us. This map was an amalgam, and it was really it took me time to sort of to put these different fronts in perspective, because I was a little skeptical of my own thesis. Like, is this a real front? Because I've been reading great Ottoman histories of this space. But once I saw it mapped, and I saw the chronology, and I saw the movement, they really did feel like mirrors. These maps, these fronts felt like they were something similar was happening in these spaces. And so seeing it physically mapped across on these spaces really did make these fronts come alive, in the sense of they were active, they were moving, they were interactive as well, because there are a lot of debates about should soldiers be moved from the Western Front to the Middle East, and generally it's no, they're using soldiers from India. So these debates are happening, and actually personnel, the question of where personnel is going is crucial in this. And I don't know that I would have seen that if I hadn't done that map. And I hope people use this map. I do. I hope people use it and start to look at the fronts in that way. And I feel like this is a piece of primary research as much as it is an illustration in my book. Thanks for that question, Nadia.
Go ahead, Jack.
Hey, thank you very much for the talk. I'm really intrigued by the project. I haven't had the chance to read the book yet, but I was really taken by something that I believe was in Tammy's comment, where it was the idea that the treaty of 1923 was very much not on the terms that the British would have ideally wanted, that they sort of had lost control of the process, and that we can see the difference from what had been agreed even just a few years before in the earlier version. And I was wondering if that extended to maybe even like the economic aspects of the treaty. I'm only mentioning this because it always seems like that when I teach this in my courses, 18th, 19th, 20th century, it's always the economic terms of these things that the British almost care most about it. And I'm wondering if they're actually even losing control of the ability to get those economic concessions in the 1923 treaty.
Well, it's about oil, right? in this moment, and it's the Americans who kind of keep ducking in and out of the story. And the question of oil concessions, you can start to see emerge. They're not part of the treaty per se, in a sense that the British are losing out in any way, but you do see the economic considerations. The debt question is interesting. So when it comes to the question of Greece and Turkey, Greece can't pay war reparations, and so there's no question that it's interesting that Greece is considered like they should be paying Turkey, which also shows the flip right at this moment. So they concede some territory. War debt too. The question of war debt becomes something that's much more muted. There's no sense of the vengefulness of making the payment of reparations in this time, which is, I think, kind of interesting. And I think what it does do is it allows Turkey to get on its footing in the 20s, because they're not faced with the kind of decisions that Germany's making about paying back anybody. And I hadn't thought about this, Chuck, until you said that, but that also might make the case for why this feels like a treaty where Turkey was the victor, because I don't mean to imply they got off scot-free with all of these, with those concessions, but if you compare it to Versailles, what Turkey is being asked economically and even territorially to give up is, well, I should say Turkey has to give up Mesopotamia and that region. That's big, but Anatolia is not divided, and that was the goal. That was the goal of the Allies when they went into Lausanne. They wanted to enforce that with Sèvres. So I think it is interesting if you compare the two moments, Versailles in 1919 and Lausanne in 2023. There's a very different mood, and there's a very different sense of what is owed by the defeated power. And there's a quote, someone says, this is a moment when a vanquished power becomes victor, after it's signed. So that's a great question. And I think there's a lot of work to be done that might compare those two moments. And you got me thinking about that. Thank you.
Susie, go ahead.
Michelle, thank you so much for this book and for this talk. Thank you, everyone who is participating. I can't remember if either Tammy or Sue said one of the great things about Michelle is that she's a cultural and a military historian. And I think my question picks up on this and also continues on Dane's question. So Dane asked about sort of like, why do we even keep 14 to 18, right? I guess I have a fundamental question about, like, do you have any insights into the persistence of that in the face of all this other evidence? And more broadly, in a global context, and especially a Middle Eastern front context, if you would care to comment about the specificity of Christian and non-Christian identities, not religiously, I'm not saying this is the theological war, obviously, but the notion of the white Christian European, and if that is a piece here. Yes, definitely is a piece. So what's interesting when you look at what the British are up to in these treaty negotiations. So Curzon isn't at the front. I had some great images of Curzon I wanted to share, but I thought, well, I'll still make a talk about Curzon, right? But what's happening is, it's these Victorians who are making this peace. And it's these Victorians who I wrote about in Smyrna's Ashes who are deciding that somehow Armenia and the Assyrians and even the Greeks have claims on this territory, historical claims. And so when they're arguing about Lausanne to replace Sèvres, which is a much more favorable treaty to minorities, the Christian minorities in particular, they're saying things like, what are you saying happened to these people who are no longer there? Did they just run away? Like what? Like they're accusing essentially the Ottoman Empire of genocide. They don't have that language. And when the division of Anatolia is being discussed, even Italy gets a little piece in this figuring. It's about homelands. And it's about carving out homelands, historic homelands for these Christian minorities who were victims of the genocide in the war, but also had this historic link to British humanitarianism, to British culture. So what we see is it's absolutely, I wouldn't call it cross and crescent politics necessarily, but I do think that this motivation, this idea that nations, that small nations, they called them the small nationalities, deserved homelands and spaces, was very much part of this peace process in a way that animated Sèvres and was a real disappointment at Lausanne. And I talked a bit about how economically and the reparations and those sort of things were different. I think that Lausanne was a moment where the British really gave up on this sort of liberal utopian vision. And I do think it was utopian, that somehow these lands, there was room for everybody, and you were going to carve out these homelands, and that it was going to be fine. And I think that it also, if we see it through that lens, it also shapes how we think about the states that are carved out in Mesopotamia. We think about Syria, especially with the French putting Syria was the homeland for Christians, right? It helps us, I think, understand that as part of a longer process. And I think if there's anything I want to do is to not just understand the war within these boundaries of 1911 to 1923, but to look at somehow some of these issues and causes are truly rooted in a Victorian period. And it's a treaty negotiated by Victorians and their Victorian sensibility. They are bringing all of this language to the table. So yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question, Susie.
Thank you. Susan, did you want to have a question?
Right. Thanks. Yeah. So Michelle, thanks for this. And I have your book, but I haven't read it yet. I wanted to ask you a little bit about how it might have changed the book, or how you think about the connection to kind of Ottoman historians and Ottoman historiography, particularly at this moment. I mean, if you were an Ottomanist, how would you have written this book? And particularly at this moment where, you know, the universities are so beset in Turkey right now, and there's a kind of, you know, there's revisionist scholarship going on at the same time. And I wondered if there was, I felt this years ago when I was working on international history, that how helpful it was to go and be somewhere else and see that my questions weren't another national historiography's questions. And I wondered whether you had felt you had to confront that, or if so, what it did, particularly in relation to the kind of Ottoman historiography, because that's also the historiography that I felt I have least access to and I can't work in the archives. I can't. So I'm always aware of how little I know when trying to deal with, you know, this kind of other optic on this whole period.
That is a great question. It was one of I approached this with some trepidation. I had the benefit of an anonymous reader who read the manuscript and inserted all the wonderful Arab Ottoman historiography, the most recent stuff. It was such a gift, and it forced me back into monographs. So again, reading in English, obviously English and French were the languages for this project. But it showed me exactly what you said, which is they are asking different kinds of questions. Especially, the Ottoman historiography was very important, I think, but the Arab historiography was amazing, because the kind of questions they're asking about this moment and this war are embedded in humanitarianism, in internationalism, in nationalism. Like, the questions are so textured and so layered because their relationship with the Ottoman Empire is so complicated. Right. So back to the Ottoman historiography. So the Ottomans, 1923 is an important year. It's the birth of the Turkish nation, Kemal, right? So I was also very concerned about writing a book that said the birth of the nation was birthed on the back of this disaster at Smyrna, with Kemal burning a city to the ground, with Kemal expelling these minority populations that had lived there. I mean, we talk about, there's a whole nother story about Nansen, and we talk about the unmixing of population stuff. Nansen, it wasn't Nansen. Nansen went over to the Ottoman Parliament, talked to these folks, and they said, we are going to expel them whether you do or not. And the idea that somehow the nation was born on the backs of this sort of xenophobic nationalist project is not something an Ottoman historian can say at all, whether you're located in the United States or abroad. So my book is very much, I don't want to call it a rejoinder, but it's complicated. It doesn't fit well into an Ottoman story nicely. So the people, just as an aside, I've been asked to talk to many Greek groups, which I wasn't asked for Smyrna's Ashes, even though it was about the burning of a city that was mostly Greek. And I realized that it's because of the contemporary questions about the Treaty of Lausanne and its implications. They want to open it up, the territory concessions. So I didn't even realize. So it's funny how you hit a nerve in a place that you didn't quite know. But I don't think that my story can be reconciled with the heroic birth of modern Turkey in any way. It'd be great if it could, but I don't know that it can. So I really appreciate that question.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Go ahead, Arenema.
First of all, thank you for the book. I missed majority of the talk because I totally messed up time zones, and it's on me. I am so sorry. But I just wanted to, and this is not a question but a comment kind of thing, but it's a comment that comes out of appreciation. And I wanted to say that you bring in so much care for the people that you write about, for the nations that you write about. It's inspiring. And I just want to say thank you for that.
It's funny because I wrote this book during COVID. So like my kids were like forced to hang out with me, right? And so they'd say, oh, what'd you do today, Mom? And I'm like, oh, well, I discovered this thing about this group of people who were living here, and then they were forced to move here, and I thought to myself, what would it be like to hear your mother talking about people that you've never met in a region you've never gone to? But I felt like I was spending time in these places and spaces, and the complexity, I never had an appreciation for the complexity of the groups that were living side by side in the Ottoman Empire with one another, and how the end of the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the region called Mesopotamia, right, was the destruction of that really threw open all of those questions about belonging, and how were you going to deal with it if when Armenian refugees show up on your shore from, they're kicked out of the refugee camp, like, do you welcome them or do you tell them to keep going? And there's this little boy who writes this book, and he says, I remember that the Arabs welcomed us like we were their brothers, and those kind of stories, you think, wow, like, it isn't that story of that we hear all the time, that everybody hates each other, and then everyone, there are these alliances that get created out of wartime that I think are quite important for us to understand in history. And it was very humbling for me to sort of to complicate that story of people living like this and figuring out how to make the best of situations that were truly horrific. And just, it also brings me back to these new wars of annexation that we're having in the Ukraine and in Armenia with Azerbaijan. one of the things they keep saying is, well, in the Soviet time, we all lived fine together. I don't think that was necessarily the case, but you see these moments where where communities are living side by side, and sometimes at war, sometimes at peace, and that's more the norm than the sort of idea of these sort of separate nation states that's becoming idealized almost in a utopian way in this moment. So thank you, Arunima.
And Elaine, would you like to ask a question? Oh, you're still on mute.
I'm an 18th century historian, so I'm about to probably reveal my ignorances. I have not read your book on Smyrna, nor the current one, but I live in Kansas City, where we have the National World War I Museum. And I'm going to encourage them to perhaps invite you to come and speak. But where I learned the most about Smyrna, it was actually in a documentary that the BBC did some time ago on Alfred Kahn. And I didn't know if you were familiar with that.
I am not, but I should be, I guess.
Well, Alfred Kahn was a banker with more money than time, but he hired photographers, and a couple of his photographers ended up in Smyrna. And so there's a very extended segment on what happened there with the photographs and the film that these men took. So I highly recommended it. So I think it's called the Wonderful World of Alfred Kahn or something, but I do recommend it.
Well, what got me on Smyrna was all the great recording of great meaning big recording of this event in the British archives. So the Imperial War Museum had testimonies of soldiers who were there and watched it burn, and you would get the images. Oh, and the reason we know who started the fire is because there was an insurance claim filed that the insurance adjusters needed to get to the bottom of it. And when money's involved, you're going to figure out who started this fire. So the reason a British historian is working on the burning of Smyrna is because many of our eyewitnesses, just like you say, came from there. And one of my favorite moments of writing Smyrna's ashes was the Imperial War Museum makes you write to these soldiers' families to make sure you have permission to publish there. And I didn't have very much, and I thought, oh, this is a burden. Oh, I'm just publishing a sentence. I was very insensitive to this. So I wrote to, and everyone was very nice. And this one grandson writes me back, and he says, my dad, in our family photo album, we have images for when he was on the destroyer and watched the city burn. Would you like them? And so not only did I have his grandfather's testimony, in the official archives, but I had these amazing images that were taken by somebody who was told, you need to be an observer, you're not a participant. And the dilemma that the sailors, I said soldiers, but the sailors faced was really quite, it added a human dimension to it and a texture to it. Just like, how would you be able to sit and watch the city burn? And the way he dealt with it was to document it, and that's why we have them. And the British archives are amazing for that moment.
I'll look forward to reading both your books.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Rachel, go ahead.
I have a bit of a question about method. There's a decade between thereabouts between Smyrna's ashes and between the last treaty. How has your approach changed or evolved with dealing with these stories that really center human suffering and catastrophe and disaster, particularly with an eye towards all of the teaching and public history work that you've done around topics like genocide?
Oh, that's such a good question. These are hard stories to live with, in the when you read them. And in fact, I almost couldn't do this book because I was sitting in the Imperial War Museum and I was listening to, because, you know, some of it is recorded and some of it is on paper. And so I was listening to this woman speak about her mother, and she was describing her mother's journey. Like her mother was a refugee, an Armenian refugee, and she was describing the places they went and how they went. And this chill goes down my spine because it mirrored the story my grandmother told me once. Of her, and she spoke about it. She never spoke about the Armenian genocide because she was very, 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 very little. But she described this trail, and I think it was also not just her stories, but other stories. I thought, I am the wrong person to do this, because these are not just stories. And then listening to the soldier's story of watching the caravans. He was like, we watched the caravans go, and we'd walk by, and there would be a child on the road that was alive 1 minute. And so, like, occupying this space, it was very different with Smart as Ashes. There weren't very many people in Smart as Ashes, but in these books, these stories became very, very important to telling the military history. And so the book cover is a very military history cover. So if you see it, and I fought with my editor. I'm like, this is not a military history. And I had this great idea. I was going to put this burning olive tree on it. It was going to be about peace and symbolic. And thankfully, Tammy and Nadia and Sue were very helpful in telling me this was probably a bad idea too. But I realized that I didn't think I wrote a military history, but I realized to tell the human story, I had to tell the military story. So method. I think collecting these stories and hearing the patterns, because I'm a cultural historian, I just kept looking for the patterns and mapping those patterns onto this military narrative allowed me to sort of get through the project. Because if I have this whole other mapping project where I map refugee routes, where I read memoirs and I use it through ArcGIS. And I don't know that I'll ever finish that one. That one is just too hard. But there's something about mapping it onto this military narrative and this diplomatic narrative that allowed me to tell stories that were hard to hear and hard to relate and very personal. And like, who am I to tell your story? Those questions were difficult. So yeah, a different book and lots of starts and stops. I was not sure this was the right thing for me at this moment, but thanks for that question.
Yeah, and if I would just jump onto something you just sort of said in terms of when you were approaching this, and it is sort of balancing so many different things. We think about these individual stories, but when you think about, diplomacy and the diplomatic aspect, you're, traditionally thinking of a sort of different narrative, a grander narrative. And then military also is somewhat, seems very different at times. And I'm wondering, like, while you were going through the process, how you balanced those different aspects as you wrote the book.
Well, the military narrative gave me things to hang stories on, if that makes any sense. So the whole concentration camp chapter, I'm following Allenby moving through space. Like this was we always think about World War I as this war of trenches, right? But if you look at the Middle East, it starts as trench warfare in Gallipoli, but in Mesopotamia, when Allenby takes over, and Allenby is Lloyd George's man, like he is Allenby. Lloyd George says, "You take Jerusalem by Christmas," and boy, Allenby does it, But the way he does it is with this rapid movement. He was a cavalryman, like he horseback, right? He's like, okay, we're in the Middle East. We can't use railroads. We're going to use horses. And he had these units that were moving through these spaces. And what I found was, as I could map these camps and figure out where people were ending up, I could also track the battle movements, because the concentration camps were being formed to get civilians out of the way and to support infrastructure, so people didn't, go over to the or didn't maintain their loyalty to the Ottoman side, I should say. And it was a really effective way to be able to tell stories of what happens when people get in the way of a military action, right? Which is exactly how they were kind of. But Allenby, though, he didn't see most of these people in the way. He had this, again, Victorian ethos, this humanitarian ethos, where people really did seem to they kind of loved him, actually. It's kind of interesting, like these refugees who ends up in these camps. Not everyone, right, of course, but like the refugees see him as a force. So really seeing those connections between how the military and humanitarian overlap, how they are part of the same mission. They're not just parallel lines, but how they rely on each other allowed me to map the human story on top of the military one, because they were integrated. They were integral. And I think to understand humanitarianism today, we have to understand how it grew up with the military. And the military is crucial in the story. And in some ways, it was kind of easy to map those two, because they were stories that were happening simultaneously. But if you just read the military, or you just read the concentration camp stuff, you wouldn't see those connections. So it kind of evolved, but I'm convinced humanitarianism has to be read in connection with military events like war.
Thank you. And do we have any last questions? All right, well, I can't thank you enough, Michelle. And I want to thank everyone else for attending. Oh, and if you want, you can check back on our website. We will have one of these basically every month for the next several months, and we're really looking forward. You can check back for that information, and it'll also be sent out via email. But in the meantime, I hope everyone will join me in thanking Michelle, and congratulations on the publication.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Sue. And thank you all for coming. It was really good to see you all. And I appreciate your interest in the book.
Thank you.